Welcome to our online DiscoveReads event. I'm your host, Lisa, and this evening I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Gwen Adshead. Welcome, Gwen.
Oh, hello, Lisa, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
It's brilliant. I've just been telling Gwen that obviously her book, The Devil You Know, is just superb. It's been chosen by Suffolk readers, and I'm just utterly thrilled because it's phenomenal. And, you know, Gwen, for those that are watching live and catching up on our YouTube channel who haven't read the book, how would you describe it to them?
That's such a great question, Lisa. And I guess the easiest way is to start by saying that I'm a therapist. I'm a psychiatrist and a therapist who works with violence perpetrators. And this book is really an invitation to come and look at the world that I work in, come and meet some of the people that I see, come and hear some of the conversations that we have. And I also thought it was an opportunity to invite people to learn something more about people who we often see as monsters. And when I first started out as a therapist, you know, I had all the same kind of beliefs that these were very horrible people and it'd be very scary. And actually what I learned along the way was so important about how humans can get confused, can lose their way, about that possibility for good and evil in every one of us. And I thought that was really interesting, and I thought that probably other people might think that was interesting too. So that's really what the book is about. The book is about how people come to do terrible things and how we can help them rehabilitate afterwards.
And it's just such an important book. And obviously you worked with Elaine on it, who's a storyteller. Will you be able to tell us a bit about what that process was like for you, and how, which you touch upon in the book, how you created those composites that, you know, protected and respected those that were involved in those sort of crimes?
Well, let's start with that, because that's really important. I'm sure everybody who's listening knows that all doctors have a duty of confidentiality and privacy. So it was not possible at all for me to talk about actual people and to tell their actual stories, because that would be to expose them in a way that I'm not entitled to do, but also potentially to expose their victims. So what I needed to do, if I was going to do this work, is I needed to find somebody to help me create stories that were clinically accurate. So in terms of, you know, what actually happens, they're factually correct, and they're kind of based on fragments of the hundreds of different people I've seen over 30 years or so in the business. But Eileen, because she's a professional storyteller, she's a television producer, and she's involved in Radio 4 book abridging, and she worked in television for over 20 years. So she's a professional storyteller, and it was she working with her enabled us to create these composite stories. I always thought of it as a bit like building up a mosaic with lots of little fragments from lots and lots of different people, and eye color here, hair color there, a kind of, you know, terrible violence here, you know, building up a picture. And Eileen helped me to do that. It was very much an act of co-authorship, you know, which was really a very rewarding experience. And what we did was we created a number of questions that we thought would act as a kind of framework for every story. What was the problem that the patient was having? What was the problem that I as a therapist was having? What was the ethical problem? Because that's often something, the kind of moral issue is something that all of us have an interest in. So what we would do is we would draft these chapters, and then they would go back and forth between us. And it turns out that an international pandemic is a good time to write a book. I know I don't wish in any way to minimize the suffering of the nations and the people who suffered, but you know, if you were well and hearty, there was a lot of time to write. And the other thing is that Eileen lives in California, so she's on an alternate time zone to me. So when I was asleep, she could edit, and when she was asleep, I could edit. So we were able to create the work really well, and we worked together very well, and it's been a very rich and enjoyable process.
How long did that all take? You coming together and both looking at them and creating this amazing book?
Well, I guess we first started talking about it in 2017, and we started writing the proposal and the sample chapters, which is what you do when you're doing a pitch to book publishers. And it was only it was in 2019 that we got the commission from Faber. We obviously were thrilled to be offered a chance to be published by Faber, because, you know, we're both poetry lovers. So Faber, of course, has published masses of fantastic poetry, for a very long time, over 100 years. And so after we got the offer from Faber, we then started work, and we submitted I think we submitted at the end of 2020. And it was published in 2021 in hardback and then in paperback last year.
And as already said, it's an amazing book, and there's 12 different stories that Gwen and Elaine have put together for us to get this kind of insight as a reader. And, you know, personally, I believe that only hurt people, and it doesn't make it okay, but I feel like it brings a kind of level of understanding to why people behave in the way they do. And Gwen, you said in the past that the patients you worked with are not mad or bad, but sad. And, you know, is that an outlook you always had, even before your role as a psychiatrist, or is that something that you found has developed over the years of working with these people and the patients?
It's very much developed. So when I started, I think I had it in my mind that mad or bad was a kind of binary opposition. And I, of course, have met people who've been mentally very disturbed, but have also been in states of mind that I would consider to be cruel and demeaning of others, and might approximate to the kind of state of mind that we would call evil. But often that's been in conjunction with serious mental illness, but also masses of trauma. I mean, one of the things that I learned as first as a junior forensic psychiatrist and then more senior, and as I began to do more and more therapy, and especially when I started running therapy groups for people who killed, what I learned was the amount of trauma that people had suffered, which had clearly affected the way that they reacted and related to other people. And I also learned that violence is not something that's kind of a feature of a person's personality. It's kind of something that any of us could do if the right risk factors in place. And Eileen and I talk about this idea of a bicycle lock model, where if you get all the numbers to line up right, and then the last number falls into place, and then boom, got the violence erupts. So that's how I came to think of the people that I work with as sad. That rather that we didn't really, what I notice most is the sadness, I think, of the people that I work with, because they're sad, there are huge regrets about what they've done.
And I think that's one of the things that's so brilliant about your book, because you tell us about the people behind the headlines, behind this sort of gratuitous story of, evil, like flashy words that get people's attention, but doesn't really tell you very much about the person involved. Yet you're able to do that so brilliantly in the book. And I think that's really, like, what you're talking about is so important for us to start realizing they're human beings. And when you said about the bicycle lock, yeah, I keep thinking, but for the grace of God, because
yeah. And that's how we end the book, in fact. Because that was certainly, what I've been learning across my working lifetime, and that's what Eileen came to learn too, that actually, if we had been through some of the experiences that these people had been through, and if we had also had a terrible substance misuse problem and a terrible mental health problem, and then had found ourselves in this and often very difficult or frightening situations, and we might do something truly terrible too. and that that actually there's a lot of issues around chance here. And as you say, the stories that are often told about these people are the sort of cold, callous killers who kind of delight in being cruel. And I mean, there are some people like that, but they're very few. I would say that they are the minority, and most of the people who commit acts of serious violence, if you actually spend time talking to them, will tell you stories of great trauma. Not in a way to try and get your sympathy or anything. It's not that kind of transaction. It comes out very slowly over time, and it helps you to see how they might then approach other people with a very suspicious state of mind, and and what you might almost call kind of paranoia, and a complete lack of trust in other people. Why should I trust you?
And a real insight into how they view the world and how their internal thinking takes place, because it can be so massively different between one person and the next, of how they view the world, how they view themselves, how they view others.
Yes, no, it's true. I mean, I was just having this conversation with some colleagues the other day, and we were thinking about how different people who kill can be. Sometimes you can meet someone who's killed in a kind of planned way, because they've come to believe that the man next door poses a risk to them, and it kind of grows, and they ruminate, and they get kind of obsessed with this idea. And then we meet other people who kill because they're overwhelmed with fear or terror, or sadness, or we meet people who kill because they're hearing voices that tell them to do so. They don't want to do it, but they can't think of anything else to do. And this issue about reality distortion is really important. Most people who kill, for example, at the moment of killing, their whole perception of reality is often grossly distorted in a way that doesn't really make it sensible for us to think of them as being kind of sort of an ordinarily sane. I mean, that doesn't mean that they aren't also sometimes in cruel states of mind. And this isn't, and one of the key messages we wanted to try, and I was very keen to try and get across in the book, was there's nothing about this kind of human approach to offenders that attempts to in any way excuse what they've done. We condemn their violence, absolutely, and we condemn it with them. When I have a therapy group that I run in the hospital still, and I say, when it often comes up in conversation, and I say, all you guys are here because you did something horrible. We're not pretending that it's not horrible and it's not condemnable, but we are seeking to understand how it came about and how they let themselves do it, because we think that's in all our interests. If we understand how they came to do it, then maybe we can stop them doing it again, and other people like them intervene early.
And it's you saying that, Gwen, leads on really well from a question from Louise, who's read your book. She said it was very intriguing. And you touch upon this in your book as well, which is you constantly hear of lacking resources in mental health services. Do you believe this will improve, or will things only worsen? And how does this also impact on the victims of crime?
Yeah, such an excellent question, Louise. Thank you. I'm afraid that mental health services are in a very difficult state at the moment, because the funding was cut 10 years ago, and we are in a very different place from where we were 20 years ago, say in 2007, say, so 16 years ago, when we had there was a lot of money in the health put into the health service. And the way that health services are delivered, as you probably know, are delivered through NHS trusts. But and those trusts work really well if the central funding is high. But if it doesn't run well, if there are cuts to the funding, and what that means is you get cuts to frontline staff, and you also get pressures to try and treat people like conveyor belt objects. and push them through the system as quickly as possible, which is really, it might work for fractured hips, but it really doesn't work for fractured minds. Seriously. So I am not at all optimistic that things are going to get better, not until we get a change of vision in terms of healthcare. And that healthcare also needs to be integrated with social care, not just for the elderly, which is the obvious place, but actually in relation to CAMS, to children and young people's mental health services. And one of the things that we could really do with improving, I mean, we've made some improvements, but there's more to do. We need more perinatal mental health. We need more parental mental health services, because a lot of people, we know that violence in adulthood is associated with exposure to physical abuse and neglect in childhood. So this is not a reason for having a go at parents, but it's just a recognition that being a parent is tough. And actually, the more we can support parents, then perhaps the more likely it is that we'll perhaps help them not to be neglectful or physically abusive.
And from what you're saying there, Gwen, it's a tricky thing to ask, but do you think some of the patients you've spent time with, if they had got appropriate support for their mental health while still in the community, do you think it's possible they would never have committed the crime, like violent crimes, in the first place?
Oh yeah. Oh yes, that's without a doubt. I was just talking about a case today of a young man who started having all sorts of problems when he was a teenager. He had a bit of a substance misuse problem, again, very, very common. He didn't get any, very much help. He was not very connected to his family. He developed a mental illness. He kind of dropped in and out. The mental health services would treat him for a bit, then they would discharge him, treat him for a bit, then they didn't offer him a kind of continuous supportive care. And he then missed one of his appointments and dropped out of sight for a bit. And this was around the time of COVID. So that was really the last number in the log. He dropped out of sight. The mental health services lost sight of him. COVID came and everybody was very frightened, and it was very difficult to think about people like this young man. And he committed he became grossly mentally unwell, and he killed somebody. So his case is a lovely example of how, well, terrible example if you, but it's a perfect example of how the risk factors all come together. Not just one thing caused the homicide, but a number of factors. If he'd had better support, if there'd been somebody to talk to him, if there'd been someone to get to the roots of what his mental illness was, as well as giving him medication, if there'd been somebody to make sure he didn't drop out of care, and if people have been able to try and, I mean, it was very difficult in COVID, but actually, we know from all sorts of, during the lockdown, people got dropped and lost.
And I think it must be really challenging when you see cases like that, going in and thinking this could have been prevented. The example you gave about the bicycle lock is, well, I know it's like a series of events, isn't it?
Yeah.
Generally, people don't wake up one morning and go, I'm going to kill someone today.
Exactly. And it really is like that. But it's in Julius Caesar, that between the acting of a dreadful thing and the first motion, all the interim is like a dreadful dream. And I think many of our people, their mental health begins to fragment, and they begin to move into a kind of nightmarish kind of state where they're not sure what's real and what's not. And this is an opportunity for people to step in and support them. But if it doesn't happen that way, then they cause a dreadful tragedy and a disaster. But as much for the victim and the other extended people who are affected by the victim's death, they also lose their lives, if you see what I mean. In a way, because it means that they will be locked up and contained. And I'm not criticizing that process, it has to happen, but nevertheless it's very sad when that happens. I'm so sorry, that noise you can hear is my cat.
Oh, it's all right. Mine might join them shortly.
He's keen to sit down. You're on air. Sit down. So.
No, it's honestly, I totally understand. My cat's in the background of quite a few of my online events. And when you're saying about the cases, one of the things that I feel like you did so brilliantly in your book is bring that humanity in to make you understand that for those that haven't explored the subject previously, that they started off as normal people.
Yes. Yeah. I think that, you see, I mean, I very rarely meet people who have been planning to kill in the way that you've described. I mean, the only people who do that are the very occasional sort of hitman type of person. But they, of course, are not people who we think of as being kind of deranged killers. They're people who are killing for money. And a bit like soldiers, of course, and we're grateful to our soldiers for making their sacrifice. But of course, they go to war to kill on our behalf, and so they are people. But they are people who say, I'm going to get up and kill somebody, but we don't, quite rightly, we don't condemn them, and we don't think that they're mad. Or so actually, and because homicide in particular is such a rare event, I mean, really, it's really extremely rare event. So the idea that it's a decision that people would make and actually seek to do. It's very unusual. I mean, there are some people who kill for financial gain, of course, but they don't come my way because nobody thinks of them as being mentally unwell. Although it's an interesting question, really, about whether to kill for profit is actually a bit bizarre.
And that they're all mentally unwell if they're doing things like that.
It's something that I wrestle with. I have to say, it's something that I wrestle with. You're making me think of a man whose case I was kind of very loosely involved in. I think because the lawyers were trying to work out whether there was any kind of defence at all, and he had killed one wife. Although we didn't know that at the time, but a wife had died and he collected the insurance, and then he was done for attempted murder of another wife. Yeah, it's always good to take a history from any widowers you plan to marry, I think. And we were trying to work out, it was kind of put to me, isn't this a bit mad to be doing this on a sort of serial basis? And I was saying, well, killing for profit is not generally thought of as being evidence of mental disorder. On the other hand, actually, so few people do it. It's statistically very unusual thing to do. If you really don't like your partner anymore, it's probably cheaper ultimately to leave them rather than kill them. I mean, killing is an odd thing to do. So yeah, I think, although I have to say, of course, that the statisticians in the audience will be saying, well, you're only dealing with the sample of people that get caught. What about the people who don't get caught? But as far as we know, the police always say that their clear-up rate for homicide is pretty good. There's not many people who kill and get away with it.
In your career, the people that you've personally dealt with in cases, have you ever felt, we've said how important an intervention is with someone with their mental health. Have you ever felt like it's just not quite working?
Yes.
Like that you feel like what you're putting down isn't helping that patient?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was saying earlier on about how our people sometimes really take a long while to build up trust. So the therapy with offenders often takes much longer than it takes with other people because they take so long to build up trust, and that's fine. But that means it can often take you a while to work out. Yeah, it's often a bit technically tricky to work out whether this isn't working because we still haven't built up enough trust yet, or whether this isn't working because this person isn't really interested in understanding what happened. And I've had a case like this very recently where I was working with somebody and I was just getting this very strong feeling. They were coming and they were perfectly pleasant, but I just felt that we weren't really on the same page. We weren't really creating a kind of therapeutic narrative that we could think about what had happened. And so I ended that piece of work and went back and talked to the other people, other clinicians looking after him, to say, I think you need a different tack. I think talking to me individually isn't going to be the way to go.
What's, in your experience, what's normally suggested then? Because one of the things you also talk about in your book is group therapy. And I imagine that's very helpful, because there are, in a lot of cases, I'm sure, that you talked about people that don't find it very easy to trust because they've had a lot of trauma themselves. But by putting them in a group of people that they can go, oh, you're like me.
Yes.
Break down those walls.
You put your finger on it, Lisa, that actually, although it's very natural for human beings to feel a bit anxious when they join a group, actually, if people can just start talking a little bit amongst themselves, they realize that that A, they're not alone, and B, they recognize something of themselves and other people. But that sense of not being alone, and that, oh, there's somebody else in the same boat as me, is incredibly freeing. And that's why we set up this therapy group for people who killed, because this was an idea that had come from some wonderful colleagues in America they'd set up a group of people who killed their parents when they were mentally ill. And I thought, look, we could do that, because actually, we began to think that actually the people who could really help would be people who've been in the same boat. That the therapists we have knowledge and expertise, which is not unuseful, it is useful, and we can come at it from our perspective, and that's useful too. But the people helping each other who've lived through this process, who've lived through the aftermath, who are struggling with what it is to have killed somebody you love and what happens afterwards, they can speak with a kind of authenticity and real care that we can't as therapists. And the other thing that's really important about group work for offenders is, I'm sure everybody would agree that one of the things about a criminal offender is that they're in an antisocial state of mind when they commit their offense, whatever it is, even if it's just stealing a bunch of bananas, it's a kind of antisocial state of mind. So to be in a group with other people taking offending seriously is a step into something more pro-social. It's a first move into being part of something else with other people. And from that point of view, it's really effective in a way that one-to-one therapy can't be.
And when you said, obviously, you're just talking about the immense benefits of putting people in the room who have those shared experiences. One of the other questions from Louise, she asked about the Orange Book idea. So obviously there are people in the book that get these, and she wanted to know what your opinion was of using that kind of method, and could it actually make the recipient more hostile? Because they, as you touched upon in the book, it puts like a breakbeat sticker on them for everybody else there.
Well, and for those people who perhaps haven't read it or seen it or got to that chapter yet or have no intention of reading it, the Orange books are the kind of acute care books that are used for people who are suicidal. And it's only used in prisons. It's not used in secure NHS care. But in prisons, people who are suicidal are put on this acute care and supervision regime, and that includes carrying this orange file with them wherever they go in the prison. So it lets other people know, other staff know, that they have been a suicide risk and they're still considered a suicide risk. And it's a kind of intended to make professionals take care. But of course, you're right, and Louise is right, that it does sometimes make people feel like they stand out and they feel stigmatized. And it's a real problem, because for prisons, somebody killing themselves in prison is a disaster on a number of levels, not just a human level, which, I mean, it's a terrible at a human level, dreadful. We don't want to lose anybody through suicide during a prison sentence. That's just, nobody wants that who's involved in the prison service. But also from a kind of organizational point of view, a large load of sort of serious scrutiny, serious criticism, of course, comes. So prisons really don't want that. And they want to be able to care for people who are suicidal, but prisons are really poorly resourced. I mean, we talk about resources in the NHS, and that's difficult enough in ordinary mental health, but prisons are very poorly resourced for psychological supports. And yet we know that large proportion of the population, about 40% at least of the prison population, suffer from serious mental health problems, and the levels of self-harm and completed suicide are much higher than in the general community. So prisons and suicidal prisoners that find themselves in a very difficult place together. You know, and we have a real job on as a society to think how we can improve prisoner health. Both physical and as well as mental health, and just taking rehabilitation seriously. The deprivation of liberty is the punishment, not the doing of the time, and we really need to make good on that. You know, you can't lock people up for years and not do anything to rehabilitate them. It's not sensible in terms of risk reduction, and it's a very poor use of our hard-earned tax pounds. If you're going to spend that kind of money locking people up, you at least want to get something out of it. You want to get bang for your buck, if you want.
Absolutely. I mean, when you were saying about that, Gwen, I was, before you said it, I was thinking, like, these people get out of prison someday, and yeah, if they've not had, you know, because there are people, I'm sure, that think that they shouldn't get any help. Yeah. They've committed a crime, they should rot in jail, all of those sort of things. And I also understand why someone might have that perspective, but one of the really important aspects that you just touched upon is rehabilitation. You know, generally people aren't locked up forever. They're going to be coming back into the community, and if they haven't had any help or work, what are the chances they're going to commit the same kind of crime again, or potentially worse?
Yeah, or even you're making me think of a woman I worked with who kept coming into prison because she assaulted emergency workers who she would be threatening to kill herself, and emergency workers would come out they'd be called by the police, and they would want to try and take her to hospital, and she would get into a fight with them and would assault them, often very badly. And she'd done this so many times that she ended up being sent to prison. And then she'd come out of prison and she'd do it again and do it again and do it again. And by the time I came to see her, I was working with her. She'd been inside off and on for about best part of a decade. And she said, you know, the thing is, I like it here. You know, that here people know me. They know my name. They remember my background because I come here so often. And yeah, exactly. And the prison, it wasn't just a roof over her head. It was actually people say, oh, hello, Kim, nice to see you. You're okay. Oh, sorry, it didn't work out. What should we do to try and help you next time? And, what can we do about this temper of yours, Kim? We've really got to try and help you. But Kim, she'd be saying, well, what is there out for me outside? At least here, people know me. And you see, that's the other downside of not providing rehabilitation, is you get people who actually think that they would be better off in prison. And she doesn't have to do very much to get back in. She doesn't have to do anything terribly violent. She just has to biff a policeman and she'll get back in. And not that biffing a policeman is okay, but she's not serious violence. But, there is, if we're feeling cold-hearted about it, there's an economic issue here. It costs about 50 grand a year to keep somebody in a fairly ordinary kind of prison, and much, much more than that for any kind of high security prison. So this idea, that we're going to keep people in prison forever and ever, and that'll learn them. Well, we're paying that's a very expensive way. That's a very expensive way to make us feel that we've got our own back on people who've hurt us. And like you, Lisa, I think we all understand the wish to be revenged on people who've done terrible things. I understand that, you understand that, we all understand that. But I think we have to seriously ask ourselves if we can afford the luxury of the emotion of revenge. I know, but it's easy for me to say that. It's easy for me to say that. And I'm just thinking of the poor people whose family members were murdered in Nottingham this week. You know, we don't know what will happen to the man who killed them, but you know, nobody would blame those family members for just wanting him to be locked up and forgotten about.
And just be gone.
And just be gone.
Yeah.
Just gone.
Because they're now experiencing the kind of trauma that's often led those prisoners to commit the crimes in the first place. And as a society, if we don't take ownership of that, if we don't look at it and go, this is a vicious circle that we're living in with individuals, then it continues to be perpetuated.
Well, it links up with Louisa's very sensible and thoughtful question about what we do for victims of crime. Now, you know, the budgets for these things are all completely separate. So the fact that perpetrators get therapy doesn't mean the victims of crime don't get therapy. There aren't allocated budgets like that. But it's undoubtedly the case that we don't provide nearly enough support for victims of crime. And the pain, the psychological pain that goes with being a victim of crime. Victims of crime don't often have, you know, diagnostic boxes. They're suffering, but they're suffering terrible pain, and they need support with that. And they need different kinds of support at different times. The people who are bereaved this week by murder will need one kind of support over the next 6 months, and then they'll need another kind of support when the trial comes around, and they'll need another kind of support after that man has been dealt with. I'm confident that he will be, you know, he'll be detained somewhere, you know, for a long period of time. But in a way, once the trial is done, there'll be a whole lot of new kind of support that needs to be provided. And actually, we are not very good at providing help for people with those kind of life traumas that change your world forever.
Absolutely. Someone has asked if the recording will be accessible. It will go on our YouTube channel within a few days. Our marketing team put that up on there. And I wanted to mention what Tanya has said, which is very much what we're talking about, Gwen. She said the conversation about prisoners needing support is so interesting, because if as a society we put more money into parental mental health support, as you suggested, perhaps there would not be as many prisoners needing support. As a system society, we are reactive rather than preventive. And yet, when you talk about the health NHS, they do a lot of work at times with preventativeness around illness, but that's not being reflected within mental health.
Not really. And you know, it is a massive challenge. There was a study done in a prison in Wales, which was all men who committed violent offences, and you know, they gave a kind of, they asked them about their childhood trauma, and only something like only 20% of them had experienced no childhood trauma, and the rest of them had experienced a huge amount of childhood trauma. About half of them had experienced 4 or more kinds of childhood trauma. And most of that is going to be trauma which is about living with parents who are all over the place. So living with parents with mental health problems, living with parents with substance misuse problems, living with parents who are fighting each other all the time, living with parents who are in and out of prison themselves. And these are parents who then inevitably go on to neglect their children, including, and often are emotionally abusive, even if they aren't physically abusive. And so the vast majority of people who've been convicted of violent offences have been exposed to very high levels of childhood adversity, mainly through very poor parenting. So we've got a bit of a job on to try and help people be parents. And I was having this conversation just this afternoon with a delightful young woman, this daughter of old friends of mine, and lovely young woman. She had raised in a lovely home, and she was saying to me, you know, I find looking after a new baby really hard, really hard. She said it's terrible. You know, I love my baby, but it's really hard. And I thought to myself, wow, you know, if Bernadette is finding it hard and she's, you know, got all the, you know, had all the benefits of loving parents in a stable home, if she finds it hard to be a parent, what about these young men and women who have a baby out of nowhere, have serious mental health problems, who are only teenagers themselves, who, you know, yeah, what we need to try and reach out to them, especially the women, I think, and the men as well, but the women, of course, are the ones who we have an opportunity to pick them up when they go for booking at antenatal clinics.
So they sort of become identified in the system as
Yeah.
about to have children.
Yeah.
So
And there is, and I don't want to mislead anybody, you know, it's not that people aren't trying to do this, they are. It's just that we need a really massive kind of a rollout of this kind of interventions and identification. And it's no accident that the Princess of Wales is taking this very seriously, because it's those early years development, which is what parents do, that we can really need to help with.
It's so crucial. And you know I think what you do, frankly, Gwen, is just extraordinary. And as a side note, I found myself being compassionate to nearly everybody in your book, apart from David and Marcus.
David, yes.
And Marcus, because they were quite misogynistic. You know, like you know, you murdered someone, you managed to show how much torture they were going through, and I was like, for those. And you know, for you, how do you find balance when you're spending time with patients who communicate in those kind of ways or have done really shocking things? I think you like singing, so is that something that helps bring that balance for your own self when you're experiencing those situations?
Well, I think the first step is not to pretend that you aren't feeling these things. So to be a professional is not to have no feelings about your work. It's to be able to manage your feelings at work.
Isn't it? Being honest about them.
Being honest about them, you know, so I mean, one of the things that I learned to do through training as a therapist is to be serious and honest about my feelings and open about them. And if I'm aware that I'm having a really kind of antipathetic reaction to a patient, a guy, or indeed a woman, there's a part of me that's thinking, oh, this is interesting. I'm wondering why I'm really not liking this guy. I'm really not liking this person. That's really interesting. Now, why is that? And I make a little mental note to go away and have a think about it and maybe talk about it with some peers, and we can go away and look at the notes and see if I can work out maybe there's something that this person, some feeling or emotion that they're bringing, that they're kind of putting into me. And is that something to do? Is that a bit like what happened with the offence that brought them into the hospital or into prison? Do I need to think about that? Not so much from a risk point of view, but just, is this kind of unresolved? Is there something that still needs working on? So that's the first thing, is I don't pretend that I don't have those feelings. The second thing is that I remind myself that this is to do with the work. This isn't to do with me personally. I'm here to do a job. So the fact that I feel angry or disgusted or something even frightened, you know, it's kind of, it goes with the territory. It's part of the job. It's not part of me, it's part of the job. And I chose this job, and I feel privileged to do this job. You know, I feel called to it. I feel it's a privilege. And it comes with difficult feelings, so that's part of the work. So I remind myself that this isn't to do with me personally. I don't have to feel good at work all the time. But the third thing is that I remind myself a lot that actually the people I'm working with are very unusual. And the more I do this work, the more I see the goodness, not only in the people I work with. And so, I mean, I do see goodness in the patients I work with, but I also see the goodness of people around them who are trying to help. I become, in a way, almost more sensitized to the goodness that there is in humans, as well as our capacity for evil and cruelty. And that's one of the things that makes the work really very satisfying, is that you get to see the best of people as well as the worst.
And finally, Gwen, you know, for those that read the book, that those that will read the book, what would, you know, as the writer, as the person that's experienced these things, what would you love them to take away from reading your book?
I'd love them to come away with a different kind of perspective on violence. And I'd love them to come away, for example, just this week, when they hear of something terrible happening, that a bit of them will wonder, what on earth's going on for that person? What on earth is going on in the mind of that man in Nottingham? What's his story? And we know what's going to happen to him now. What will happen to him now is that he'll be locked away for a very long period of time. We know that we doesn't matter how, we know that's what will happen. But I hope that after reading the book, people will think, I wonder what's going on for him. I wonder what his story is.
I love that. And I think that's so important. So obviously this evening we've been talking about Gwen's book, The Devil You Know, which is superb. If you've not read it, do read it. I think it should be required reading for all of us to have more understanding of our fellow beings. Really, really important. But thank you everyone for joining us live and catching up on our YouTube channel. We always have lots of events going on at Suffolk Library, so do check out our website. And finally, Gwen, I genuinely think what you do is extraordinary. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a very interesting conversation with me. Thank you very much.